Tonight, we begin with a military action that American officials have long feared, repeatedly underestimated, and silently hoped would remain theoretical. An attack compressed into 6 hours, not weeks or even days. 6 hours that exposed the fragility of every Russian ultimatum. 6 hours that forced the White House to make its first public statement in months. 6 hours that compelled Vladimir Putin to an unscheduled midnight meeting with his top military commanders. Ukraine's action today breached a boundary that Washington wished would remain intact. And when that boundary was broken, Moscow's response was immediate. They responded with confusion, silence, and a war cabinet meeting in the dark. For 18 months, there were signs, not through official diplomatic channels, nor through established clandestine channels, but only through rumors that Ukraine was planning something unprecedented. Ukraine certainly displayed aggression, but its aggressions were calculated and very precise. Its operations adhered to a recognizable logic, a discernible pattern, almost a strategic philosophy. But what has caused serious concern in Washington and London in the last 7 days is the sudden disappearance of this pattern. Intelligence experts who have been tracking Ukraine's deep-seated preparations for a coup understand the signs. The sudden redeployment of long-range drone battalions towards Molia and Odessa, the redeployment of electronic warfare units along the Black Sea coastline, the withdrawal of the most elite operators from the Donetsk fronts, unexpected silence in secure communication channels that usually maintain constant activity. We can say that everything has been plunged into dark, and whenever Ukraine falls silent, it signals that something extremely noisy is about to happen. In the very early hours of the morning, space-based infrared detection systems identified what analysts described as numerous high-speed thermal signatures launched from Ukrainian-controlled territory. These included at least 7 weapon systems that hadn't been operationally deployed for more than 2 years. These represented a category of capabilities Ukraine had reserved only for moments when it wanted to send a clear and unambiguous message. We have relinquished our authority. We have stopped respecting your so-called red lines. We are targeting assets that you have insisted were untouchable. Pentagon analysts weren't entirely sure which category this operation fell into, or if it encompassed all 3 objectives simultaneously. The only thing they understood for certain was that Ukraine had fundamentally changed its escalation strategy. And when Ukraine changes its escalation stance, even slightly without prior notice, the United States immediately recognizes it. The statement released by the White House this evening was anything but routine. It was not ceremonial. It was not merely procedural. It carried urgent senior administration officials emerging from an emergency situation room session, described Ukraine's strikes as sovereign, precise, and perhaps most significantly irreversible. The deterrence functions only when the targeted party demonstrates hesitation. Putin showed none. In fact, his response this evening ranks among the most alarmed reactions we have witnessed throughout this entire conflict. Here is what the evidence shows. Within 4 hours of confirmed initial impacts, Putin assembled an emergency consultation with Shoigu Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff and the commanding officers of the Aerospace Forces and the Black Sea Fleet. These were not the regularly scheduled security briefings. These were the emergency sessions you convene when you comprehend that your threats have been rendered obsolete. Tonight, United States intelligence. Services verified that Ukraine launched a coordinated deep penetration strike operation against 4 distinct target categories inside Russian sovereign territory, including the Engels-2 strategic bomber facility that had been recently reinforced specifically to counter this exact contingency. Ukraine struck before Russia could disperse the pair of Tu-95s and the pair of 2160s stationed there. They damaged the primary runway at Engels. They compromised the hardened aircraft shelters. They destroyed the ammunition storage facility that intelligence suggests was actively preparing to reload nuclear-capable kite. In other words, Ukraine deliberately targeted the precise infrastructure that enables Russian strategic aviation to remain operational. This factor explains why Washington's statement carried such weight and urgency. Ukraine's operation was not merely symbolic in nature. It represented an existential challenge. It demonstrated the kind of operational capability that could effectively neutralize Russian strategic air power if executed at scale. And Moscow, grasping this reality completely, responded not with demonstrations of strength, but with urgent crisis management. And here the narrative takes an even more striking turn. Intelligence officials assess that Ukraine's recent deep strike operation was specifically designed to test the true credibility of Russia's nuclear deterrence after 3.5 years of empty escalation war. Kiev wanted empirical evidence that Moscow would actually carry out the catastrophic consequences it had repeatedly threatened. Instead, the opposite happened. Russia did not launch Onyx missiles at Kiev. It did not advance tactical nuclear weapons to forward position. It held an emergency meeting and fell silent. So profoundly silent that even the most aggressively pro-Kremlin military bloggers are tonight expressing visible outrage and humiliation. You do not capture the Kremlin's full attention by exercising caution. But today, Ukraine accomplished exactly that. Defense analysts speaking with NBC News under strict conditions of anonymity characterized Putin's present state as cornered in real time, a psychological condition that historically produces either complete capitulation or the most dangerous form of escalation imagined. Yet, Ukraine demonstrated today that they remain both operationally capable and strategically unafraid. Their strikes were not only successful in execution, they were sequenced with such precision that subsequent waves exploited the exact confusion and disarray the initial wave generate. That operational sequencing matters profoundly because it demonstrates Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian actions. They are dictating operational tempo. As intelligence reports accumulated throughout the day, we learned considerably more about the scope and ambition of Ukraine's coordinated operation. The 383rd Separate Remote-Controlled Drone Regiment executed the Engels strike package, forcing the temporary grounding of Russia's entire strategic bomber fleet. Naval strike groups launching from Odessa successfully targeted Russian early warning radar installations in Krasnodar Krai that had been relocated southward within the last 6 weeks. Special Operations Command elements operating clandestinely inside Russian territory itself reportedly destroyed a critical rail bridge utilized by the 1st Guards Tank Army to transport reserves toward combat zones. This was not merely a raid. This was not merely sending a message. This represented systematic operational degradation. This constituted strategic battlefield reshaping. And strategic reshaping remains the sole objective that Putin has consistently tried to thwart since February 2022. Remember how Putin calculated that Ukraine would collapse within 3 days? He assumed NATO would disintegrate from within 3 months. He also believed that his nuclear threats would paralyze Western decision-making processes indefinitely. But tonight, the exact opposite scenario is unfolding in real time. Ukraine is displaying a greater military capacity than at any previous point in this war. NATO is showing more cohesion and unity than at any point since the end of the Cold War. And Russia's nuclear threats have been completely exposed as empty rhetoric devoid of substance. What makes this particular moment both explosive and dangerously fragile is that Ukraine's attack comes at a time when Putin's 24-year authoritarian rule is facing the heaviest domestic political pressure. The military establishment is demanding a decisive escalation to restore credibility. The security services are advocating for de-escalation to protect their institutional assets and power bases. The oligarch class desperately wants a negotiated ceasefire to save what remains of their accumulated wealth. Are they right? The propaganda apparatus is demanding absolute victory at all costs to maintain narrative control. Putin, while trying to balance these fundamentally contradictory demands, is also watching his strategic air force being rendered ineffective by a country he has publicly declared non-existent as a legitimate nation. And when leaders operating under such immense pressure make sudden strategic moves, these decisions don't stem from positions of power. They are decisions born purely of terror and desperation. The White House statement, now being circulated in complete form to every major alliance partner, was carefully constructed to signal that the United States is no longer willing to permit Russian nuclear blackmail to dictate Western policy decision. Officials stated plainly that Ukraine's actions were entirely consistent with the inherent right of self-defense under international law. That represents diplomatic language, for we are not going to stop them. You do not typically hear that particular tone from this White House unless something fundamental in their strategic calculus has shifted. Meanwhile, President Vladimir Zelensky addressed his nation in a remarkably calm, almost understated televised speech this evening. He stated, "Today we reminded the aggressor that geographic distance means nothing when justice stands on your side." He declared, "Every Russian threat carries an expiration date." And he emphasized, "We do not escalate conflicts. We end aggression permanent." These are not mere rhetorical flourishes designed for domestic consumption. These are carefully calibrated statements from a wartime leader who comprehends precisely how elevated the stakes have become and who just deliberately raised them higher. Still, here's what makes the current situation even more deeply concerning to Western intelligence analysts. Ukraine's strike on Engels was not an isolated tactical action. Simultaneously with the bomber base operation, Ukrainian partisan networks successfully derailed two separate military transport trains in Bryansk Oblast. Ukraine's cyber command reportedly disabled the Russian Defense Ministry's secure communications infrastructure for more than 3 consecutive hours. Ukrainian Air Force Su-27 fighters conducted aggressive mock attack runs on the Kerch Bridge approach vector. All of these operations materialized within the identical 12-hour operational window. When Ukraine coordinates multiple operational pieces simultaneously across different domains, it indicates the next operational phase has already commenced. Intelligence analysts are currently assessing several different strategic possibilities. One assessment suggests that Ukraine is preparing a major spring counteroffensive, requiring the preemptive neutralization of Russian strategic aviation capabilities. Another suggests that Kiev is deliberately provoking a Russian overreaction severe enough to ultimately trigger a massive Western military intervention at the Article 5 level. A third possibility causing the greatest concern among senior officials suggests that Ukraine has reached a strategic resolve that the only viable way to end this war is to make it impossible for the Putin regime to sustain itself economically and militarily. But current events significantly complicate this calculation because Russia has essentially rendered this card out of play by failing to deliver any decisive retaliatory response. What we are observing in real time is a fundamental test of strategic resolve among multiple parties. Ukraine wants to empirically verify whether Russian nuclear threats possess meaningful coercive power. Putin is desperately trying to demonstrate that he is completely in control of event. The United States is struggling to prevent an uncontrolled military escalation that could draw NATO into direct conflict. NATO aims to ensure that Russia's strategic aviation capabilities never again reach an operational readiness that would threaten alliance territory. Tonight, we have received confirmation from multiple United States defense officials who are now conducting continuous real-time monitoring of Russian nuclear forces across all domains. They report there has been no elevation of nuclear alert status. They confirm there has been no detectable movement of tactical nuclear weapons toward forward deployment positions. And they assess that Putin's decision to convene an emergency leadership meeting rather than ordering immediate large-scale retaliation likely represents part of a desperate attempt to purchase time while he determines how to respond effectively without appearing weak or ineffective to domestic audiences. But Ukraine is demonstrably not. waiting for Russian deliberations to conclude. In fact, Ukraine is systematically accelerating operational tempo. Their response today, executed with boldness, synchronized precision, and merciless efficiency, transmitted an unmistakable message to Moscow that geography no longer provides protection or immunity. And it simultaneously transmitted a message to Washington that permission is no longer a prerequisite for Ukrainian military action. As this evening progresses, we anticipate additional operational details will emerge concerning what precisely Ukraine has planned for subsequent phases. But what current intelligence makes absolutely clear is that the American statement issued tonight was both timely and transformative. It established a new strategic boundary. It fundamentally changed the operational rule, and it made explicitly clear that Russian nuclear blackmail has been officially declared dead as an effective tool of coercion. What unfolds in the next 48 to 72 hours will depend almost entirely on Putin's decision-making process and the actions he authorizes. If he lashes out with disproportionate military retaliation, this moment will be historically remembered as the catalytic spark of a dramatically wider regional war. If he does essentially nothing beyond rhetorical condemnation, Ukraine has already conclusively demonstrated they are prepared and capable of finishing this conflict on their own strategic terms. They have proven they are ready to respond with overwhelming force. And tonight, for the first time since this war commenced in February 2022, Vladimir Putin appears to be genuinely strategically cornered with severely limited options. The Kremlin remains silent, disturbingly silent. And when the Kremlin exhibits this particular quality of silence, it indicates they are frantically calculating, fundamentally reconsidering their position, and gradually realizing something they never wanted to acknowledge publicly. Their red lines have evaporated, their threats lack substance, and their war just came home to Russian territory in a manner they can never ignore or unsee. This story is far from reaching its conclusion. But tonight, certain realities have become undeniable. Ukraine just comprehensively rewrote the rules of engagement. Russia just blinked in front of the entire international community, and the United States just declared publicly, "We are not stopping them from exercising their sovereign right to self-defense. We will remain here monitoring every development as the next operational phase unfolds in real time." And now we need to understand what this means, not just for the immediate tactical situation, but for the broader strategic landscape that governs this conflict, because what happened today was not simply a military operation. It was a fundamental recalibration of the power. Dynamics that have constrained this war since its beginning. For months, Western officials have operated under a framework of escalation management. The concern was never whether Ukraine could strike deep into Russia. The concern was always what Putin would do in response. Would he use tactical nuclear weapons? Would he attack NATO supply lines in Poland? Would he unleash chemical weapons on Ukrainian cities? These were the nightmare scenarios that kept senior officials awake at night. And those fears, whether justified or not, created a ceiling on what Ukraine was permitted to do with Western-supplied weapons. But today, Ukraine demonstrated something Washington has been reluctant to acknowledge. That ceiling was always artificial. It was maintained not by Russian capability, but by Western anxiety. And the moment Ukraine decided to break through it, the ceiling simply disappeared. What we are witnessing now is the downstream consequence of that breakthrough. Russia did not escalate to nuclear weapons. They did not attack NATO. They did not unleash chemical weapons. They called a meeting. They issued no immediate public response. They went dark. And in that darkness, something shifted. The fear that had governed Western policy for 18 months suddenly looked less like prudent caution and more like strategic paralysis. Tonight, senior European officials are having very different conversations than they were having yesterday morning. French President Emmanuel Macron, who has repeatedly warned against humiliating Russia, is now facing pressure from his own military establishment to acknowledge that Ukraine's action has changed the calculation. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has moved with extreme caution on every weapon system provided to Ukraine, is reportedly being briefed on whether Germany's restrictions on German-supplied weapons are still strategically viable. And in the United Kingdom, where support for Ukraine has been most consistent, defense officials are now openly discussing whether the time has come to provide Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles in quantities that would allow sustained deep strike campaigns. Because here is what today proved. Ukraine can strike Russian strategic assets. Russia will not respond with nuclear weapons. And the West has been operating under assumptions that no longer reflect reality. But this creates a new problem and one that cannot be ignored. Because if Russia's nuclear threats are no longer credible, what will prevent this war from escalating in ways that no one can control? If Ukraine can attack Engels-2, can it attack Moscow? If they can attack Moscow, can they also eliminate the Russian leadership? And if the Russian leadership believes it is in danger of being eliminated, how will they respond? These are no longer theoretical questions. These questions are being urgently discussed tonight in secure facilities in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin. And the answers are not clear. The only thing that is clear right now is that Ukraine has decided that it will no longer be constrained by the West's fears of Russian escalation. They have decided that the only way to end this war is to show that Russia cannot win. And they have decided that this demonstration requires not only defending Ukrainian territory, but systematically destroying Russia's ability to project military force. This is a fundamentally different war from the one we have witnessed for the last 3 years. This is a strategic war of attrition aimed not at territorial gains, but at military collapse. And it is certainly a war that Ukraine appears prepared to fight, regardless of whether the West is uncomfortable with this approach. Tonight, in closing, we are left with profound questions about what will happen next, because one problem has created multiple problems. Will Russia retaliate in ways we have never seen before? Will a cornered and humiliated Putin make decisions that will take this conflict beyond Ukraine's borders? Will the West finally provide Ukraine with all the capabilities it has demanded for years? Or will Washington, Paris, and Berlin try to reimpose the restrictions that Ukraine has already shown it will ignore? We don't know the answers to these questions tonight, but the evidence we have suggests that clear answers will come soon. Evidence that Ukraine no longer asks for permission. Evidence that Russian threats no longer constrain Ukraine's actions. Evidence that the strategic assumptions that have governed this war for 18 months have been fundamentally invalidated. And evidence that we have entered a new phase of this conflict. This is a phase where the rules are being rewritten in real time, and the outcome is more uncertain than it has been since February. This isn't the end of the story. This is the beginning of something we don't fully understand yet. Good night.